is Synopsis, a series of conversations in the framework of Abyssinia Institute. My name is Neja Zupans, and today's guest is Logan Barrett. Welcome, and please, a short introduction.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. My name is Logan Barrett. I'm currently a doctoral student at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. I've been based here for a few years now. I'm originally from Florida, in the south of the U.S., and I lived there for many years. I work a lot in contemporary chamber music right now, and I also, dabble or have a bit of expertise in music technology, and it's something that I think about a lot. That's kind of my short introduction of what I do.
Great. May we start with how you got to where you are at? Specifically, how did your music education look like, and how did you come to composition?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot recently. For me, I think that music has always been a very personal thing. Like, it's just kind of my own. It's something that's very it's different from everyday life. I didn't really have piano lessons, for example, for a very long time. Um, the reason I got into music was from band. So like educational, in middle school, I played the trumpet. And I learned how to read sheet music and all of this.
So wind.
Wind band, yeah, yeah. There's a yeah. That's the kind of the standard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Most schools in the U.S., winds are in a wind band.
Mm-hmm.
But, for me, I was always really interested in what are the rules of music? Like, oh, what does that thing mean? If I don't know, this is a sharp and this is a flat, and figuring out what the symbols mean and how they relate to each other. Even more than learning repertoire or anything like that. That was always the most important thing, and the thing that I liked was figuring it out, or why this thing was this way. That kind of stuff.
The things that are usually taken for more or less obvious, granted, already there.
Yeah. I
Why are
think
they
these things
five
are
lines in the staff notation, or?
yeah, totally. Like transposition, for example. Why is that a thing? That was confusing for a while. But just
Right.
things that I was obsessed with for
Right.
for whatever reason. It was in high school. I would say I didn't really compose until university, until college, really. When I was 17 or 18, I went to a camp that was at the local university, and the professor there gave a presentation on what composing was and what that looked like in this whole world that we have. And I was really interested in that, and I basically wrote a piece to apply to college. No one asked me or told me about it or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ended up having a really good relationship with that professor,
Mm-hmm.
and went through at the University of South Florida, in Tampa, Florida. And so that was really important for me, and that's where I learned, I think really learned about music, really in university, I would say.
Would you, since we're just here, first of all, would you consider that this fascination with the fairly, let's say, unusual questions I may claim for someone, let's say, in high school, in music school, would you say that this puts you in a different position as a composer? Or if not, does it influence how you approach composition?
Yeah, I would say for me at least, I think there are certain things in composition that I have a harder time with. The idea of a fixed piece that you have, let's say 7 to 15 minutes for a chamber piece. there's a certain type of, let's say, narrative form that often goes with that, in the concert format, or the institutions that we've raised that I would say lead us towards a certain type of approach to music. And I've always had a kind of a hard time with that. Like, why does a piece have to have a beginning, middle, and end? That's something that I find that I have to deal with, because I'm fascinated with very specific things, and I try to find ways to put that into a musical form, and I try to evoke that feeling. Is that kind of what you're asking?
And also, just out of curiosity, is the composition that you wrote as the first one for application something that one can find recorded?
No.
No. Okay. Okay, that much for that. Good. What are the very specific subjects that you just said you want to bring through the
That was
Sorry?
You're breaking up a little bit.
Oh, pardon.
Yeah.
Yes, I will pick it up where we left it. So what are these very specific things that you mentioned you want to bring out in the composition?
Yeah, I think it changes a lot from piece to piece. Recently something I've really been into is learning instruments, like an instrument that I haven't played before, and kind of interfacing with that instrument in sort of a naive kind of way. Like, I have a flute and a clarinet back here that I play almost every day. And I don't look at any books. I don't learn how to play it or anything. I'll look at some sheet music sometimes and try to play it. But I really just like fiddle with it and just like, if I blow this hard, if I do this, what sound does that make? And so in a piece I'm working on right now, I'm really interested in tremolos, for example. I think they're so interesting because like it's something that's notated, but it's there's so much left up to chance in the notation of a tremolo. Like it's by definition something that's kind of more aleatoric. And it's something that's any person can play. You don't have to play a flute to be able to do a tremolo on the flute. You just move one finger. And so I'm really interested in writing pieces that kind of proceed from like these very simple, like almost acoustical or mechanical ideas on an instrument. Proceeding from that, I think stuff like that is kind of the things that I'm interested in.
Aren't tremolos on the flute usually with multiple fingers?
It depends. Yeah. There's some that I have, in my fingers right now. But there's been a few pieces I've written where I like go through, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna play this, and I'm gonna move just this finger, then I'm gonna move just this finger. If I hold these fingers down and I move just this, what notes are there? A lot of times those are not notes that the flutist learned to play, and they're notes that are not stable.
So you're playing with quarter and eighth tones as well as notes of different timbre.
It's almost like I don't even think of them as quarter and eighth tones, though. It's just like those fingers, you know what I mean? And then I have to notate that, and then we have to get into all of that. But
so, which composition is this that you are now speaking of?
Yeah, so this is a piece for flute and violin. It's a collaboration with the violin studio at Eastman, and so I asked for flute and violin because I know violin really well. And I really wanted to take the whole tremolo idea to its extreme because, both flute and violin have access to overtones, or they have timbral trills that you can do by trilling between two notes. On violin, it's harmonics. On flute, it's harmonics also, but it's a different kind of harmonic, right? And so you can overblow in the same way that you can on a violin. But the piece is playing with those things, and the idea that there are these hidden notes within one tremolo. There's like a implied note above that, and you can move in and out, and these two instruments can kind of interweave these very high and very low kinds of patterns, kind of dealing with that issue.
Mm-hmm. So if this is the specific example of what it is that interests you in working on through composition, generally, if we go to a more general perspective, I think I'm not wrong to say that mathematics and physics are playing quite a role in the way, in the method that you sometimes use. I know at least for the composition that you workshopped with Abeceda, and
Mm-hmm.
I have seen some of other of your works. So
Mm-hmm.
perhaps we have time, so I
Mm-hmm.
think you can expand much further into that direction, especially addressing it for, as I always say, for a viewer that might take interest in hearing your music, your
Mm-hmm.
per- performances of your compositions, and yeah, with another insight from this conversation.
Yeah, I could talk about that. It's something I've kind of had difficulty thinking about for a long time now. I think the reason I brought up like the obsessions about music that I had, is I think that's the reason why I compose. I was also really interested in mathematics and set theory and all of the kind of intersections between math and music as well. And I think it's for a lot of those same reasons. Um, a lot of the early compositional stuff I learned about was from post-tonal theory, let's say. Um, and then I learned about stuff, like Xenakis and sieve theory and all of these things. These are also kind of I can't really explain why. I just like them, and I wanted to use them in music. And it's kind of hard to wrap my mind around the relationship between those two things. Um, a few years ago, I was doing a lot of musical set theory with rhythm, and kind of using these to create these sculpted sections of music where, like the density throughout this section of music was very similar. And so I could kind of sculpt out, all these different things would happen at different times, but you could
Right.
hear every single one.
Mm-hmm,
And it
mm-hmm.
was kind of sonifying some mathematical idea. Um,
Sounded very coherent amongst other things. Perhaps it's because of that. Very, yeah, composed, one could say, if I
no,
think about the trio.
yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that I'll say more recently, I've kind of been more interested in just kind of the let's say the result of that. Um, or maybe what I could say is that I'm really interested in a sculptural approach to composition, and like kind of the parameterization, all the stuff that was very popular in the late 20th century, let's say. But I think kind of applying them more to timbre than to pitch. Um,
Mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
think I think you know a lot of composers were really interested in creating a new type of music, um, using pitch structures, right, or using 12 tone theory, for example, um, taking these ideas and rigorously applying them to pitch to avoid harmonic implication, let's say. Um, I find that really wasn't so rigorously applied to timbre. Um, and not just timbre and sound, but also kind of physical gesture and the ability to contain certain types of musical motion and movement, um, in different parts of the piece and in that kind of, modernist language, let's say,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
if that makes sense. and more recently, I've been really digging into that. Like, how can I sculpt out a timbre, types of musical motion, without constraining myself so much with these obsessions that I don't really have as much freedom and control over. Um, so one thing I could say about that I'm really interested in is articulations are a really good example of this. Um, I've been thinking a lot about the relationships between different types of notated articulations, and exploring the subtle differences that they kind of imply. So each articulation, for example, it means a different thing on each instrument, right? You have to do a different physical thing to make the articulation happen. It means they mean different things in different time periods of music, right? Um, and also there's kind of almost a graphic score or almost visual artistic element to these things as well. For example, you can put an accent over a note that's piano, or you can put like a sforzando on a note without an accent, right? What's the difference between those two things? And you can kind of really collaborate with the performer, right? And really sculpt timbrally and gestually what they're going to do, and how they're going to interpret that music. And in a way that's much more collaborative, I think. Like when I work with, a really specific notation like that, I can really dig in with the performer and talk about, what music are you thinking about? What kinds of things are you doing when you play this thing? And I can really make it much more collaborative than maybe what I was doing a few years ago.
Is that something that is also very important in composition, to keep the work collaborative or to make it collaborative? And for what reason, if yes?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think I feel that we hear that in music a lot, is that composition should be collaborative. And I feel like I didn't understand that for the longest time. Or as some, I understood it only in some very superficial, like, oh, I write something that's impossible, and then the performer tells me that's not possible to play on this instrument, and that's collaboration. Like I really want to make it, much more deep than that, a much more deep relationship. And so I think, articulations, for example, just notations, I think a reason those things are collaborative is because the performer can draw on their past experiences of other music, right? This thing, oh, I see that a lot in romantic music, so I can use something that's from romantic music to get a kind of romantic sound, although compositionally put it in a completely different context, right? I can draw on that performance practice, and maybe turn that on its head or contradict it or put some other notation next to it or set up some musical situation where they can't fully draw on just that performance practice, as a way to kind of, moment by moment, have the have the performer second guess themselves, or ask questions, or bring their own musical interpretation into the piece.
Through this control and sculpturalization, as you call it, of timbre, what are your findings there? What did you observe? Or perhaps have you seen any results, any achievements from this work? I'm curious.
Yeah, so I sent you this other short piece. I think yesterday or the other day.
The crab canon?
The crab canon, yeah. That's a piece that's like fresh in my mind, and I feel like it's one of the first pieces where I have found something. The idea of that piece is it's a violin solo.
No electronics?
There are electronics, yes.
Oh.
Yeah,
they're well blended. So, but still, if you said it's a violin solo, I would be scared.
Yeah. Well, so Okay, it's sort of a violin solo. So the electronics just record the violin and play it back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's a crab canon,
So
which
like that, I see. Okay.
yeah. It, so if you're familiar with what a crab canon is, it's a it is basically as old as music or Western music is. You have one line and then another line playing against that, and
Mm-hmm.
they're reversed versions of each other. This other
Mm-hmm.
line is this first one backwards.
Yeah, it's
Um,
like in words, probably there's an expression for that, but it also, for anyone that still perhaps doesn't understand what it is, you can also do it with words. What are the words that are, could be an example, that can read the same forward as backward, right?
yeah, yeah, like race car and all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
palindromes. Um, but
Pardon.
anyways, yeah. So what the electronics are doing is that it just records the violin for 1 minute, and then every minute it plays the previous minute backwards. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not just a crab canon in that I wrote pitches that are and rhythms that are reversals of each other,
Mm-hmm.
but the literal audio is reversed. Um, which I feel like is something that composers for hundreds of years have always wanted to do. But we finally now have the technology to do that. um, with all the baggage that recording and technology and computers brings to that as well. Um, but that's the idea. And so I started from that idea, right? I was like, I want to write a crab canon that's like, a newer, like revamped version of a crab canon, right? Where the other part is like literally backwards. Um, and so then I proceeded. I was like, all right, I'm going to put these different timbres. This note's going to be marcato, and like this is going to be tenuto, and this will be like a long phrase that's a little bit longer. I'll do a harmonic tremolo here to make this note come out. And then I wrote it out, like Bach would, to where I was making counterpoint between these two different lines. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so there are so many things when you start working that way. There are so many things, so many ideas I got about timbres to use, right? For example, a down bow versus an up bow that crescendos, and it's kind of like a fake reversed sound, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, and like composing a fake backwards version of that when it's turned backwards becomes the forward version or the backwards of the backwards version. All this kind of stuff. And we've been finding that like, the violinist they interpret those notations very differently because they want it to sound different when it actually gets played backwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
So an up bow that goes to a sforzando, if you lift it off the string, that's going to sound very different backwards than you would doing a down bow, right? So we like, for example, worked out an up bow gesture where they would stop it on the string and kind of crunch it at the end, so that it would kind of blend better contrapuntally with the backwards version.
Hmm.
So
Right.
they're dealing not only with that notation that I wrote, but also like the fact that timbre changes when something gets played backwards, right? Time and the way the instrument works differently. And so then we could kind of get away from what the notation was and be like, okay, what do we really want here? And we can use that, whatever I wrote down to, as a starting point. But it's really kind of about sculpting this more, a much more specific kind of shape, let's
Mm-hmm.
say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we've found that to be very useful, I think, because it's kind of it can get you away from the page, but you can use so many things at any given moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, is that kind of what you were asking?
Yes, 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 exactly. That's
Hmm.
exactly what I'm asking. Also, if you're saying, if I understand you correct, that this is only the beginning,
Hmm.
what are the next steps then? Where are you going towards?
Yeah, yeah. We'll have to find out. So we made it. We made a video version of this piece. I didn't mention this. I imagine it as a YouTube short, right? Because
Yeah.
a YouTube short is a minute long and it loops. right? And so what we did was we did a studio recording. I just recorded it a bunch of times, and then we just chose the best one, and then I made a video. I have a little bit of experience in video, so I did a multi-angle video, then made the cuts, and then like took that video and reversed it. And it wasn't until then that we actually heard the counterpoint, right? And then it finally worked.
So with the video, with both of the videos, you managed to hear different as well.
Yeah. Well, it was one video. It ended up being one video that like
Yeah.
it was only the last moment we knew what the counterpoint was because I wrote that in the score, but then like that was reversed and all of that. And then I did a little bit of, post-production to make it sound a little bit nicer.
Yes.
But the next step on that, this coming Tuesday, we're actually performing this live in concert. And so it's not 1 minute anymore. It's not a 1 minute loop that you watch on YouTube on your phone, right? We're actually just repeating it multiple times live. And so we talked a lot about how to make that happen in a live setting. And so we decided on there's two speakers behind the violinist and then two microphones in front of the violinist. And then there's a computer. I made a patch which
feedback.
records.
How do you?
There is it is feedback.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that is the idea actually. That's kind of the next step of this whole
Dangerous.
process. Yeah. There's no live amplification at all, right? It only records the past minute.
Ah, okay.
Which is interesting, right?
Curious.
Because it actually is feedback, but it's very slow feedback that would take like hours and hours to get to an uncomfortable level, what we would consider feedback, right?
I see.
But it's like it's a feedback because like usually feedback is like the distance between the speaker and the microphone, right? And so that's like a fraction of a second.
Right.
In this case, it's 1 minute long, so it's like very, very slow feedback. But I didn't think of that at first, right? I was like, I want to make a YouTube short, and now I'm thinking of like, how do I take this, idea that doesn't have a beginning or end and is meant to loop, and then actually put that in a concert setting, right? And so I wanted to actually like account for actually technologically mediating that in a live performance. So they play it. It's just them alone first, and then they play it again, but then the audio is reversed. So then they're playing a duet with themselves reversed with all the counterpoint and all of that. But then the microphone the second time records the playback from the speakers and the live violin, so that the third time you hear the original one forwards because it's the reversed version, if you get what I'm saying.
You did lose me because I thought of another question and
Yeah, sorry.
completely honestly, but it is in the lines or a continuation of the already existing pieces where there's electronics, where you use electronics and two players, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's one player, but then they're getting recorded and it's being reversed. And
But what about the one with two players? I think flautist and
that's a different piece. Different piece. Yeah.
But also electronics and but I'm thinking of the sound code, but actually that's a different thing in terms of the procedure, if I understand. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I mean, if there's something more you want to say about this, or please feel free and also to explore or present any other area of this curious composition.
Yeah, I'll just kind of maybe tie a bow on what I was saying to maybe get away from the technical stuff.
Well, and my question is also, why did you decide to publish it in the form of a YouTube short?
Yeah, well, that original version, yeah, well, I was because that whole thing, I was like, I want to like really deal with this issue, right? Because as I mentioned before, like I've always kind of struggled with the concert format and having to have a piece that has a start, beginning, middle, and end. A YouTube short, like, I'm sure we all know like the feeling of scrolling through TikTok and all of this. One thing I really liked about that, I'll say I really wanted to deal with that format first and foremost, right? Like I want to write music for classical instruments that is informed by the classical, the musical tradition that we have
Yes.
acoustically, and deal with that format. That was kind of the beginning, I would say.
And it
Um,
keeps repeating itself, and it's
yes,
not actually sometimes really clear where it stops
exactly.
when you're listening.
Yeah, because I found that like, I think in this format I really have an advantage because I don't have to write a piece that has a start, right? I find that idea very
Curious.
exciting. That
Mm-hmm.
I can still compose something that happens in time,
Mm-hmm.
um, but isn't bound by the timing of having a beginning and an ending.
Right.
I can make very different compositional decisions in that environment. Um, and also, I think just the whole short video, TikTok, YouTube short
Very
thing,
accessible. It's very to masses.
it's
It's
accessible. Yeah. And I think that the content that gets popular in that format, it's kind of designed for you to just, scroll, watch it once, maybe 1.5 times and
mm-hmm.
scroll again, right? And I think I kind of wanted to make something that warrants listening to it more than once,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I wanted to make something that would make someone not scroll away, basically.
Yes.
So when I was thinking of it, I was like, I really want it to discourage someone from just like viewing it in one ear out the other, scroll away again, next thing. Something that kind of takes that um, I don't know that kind of action, or like let's say careless or passive action, and kind of make and encourage active listening, let's
You
say.
are working against very powerful
Oh yes.
gambling mechanisms there.
Oh
So,
yes. But I think that's important, right? I
yeah,
think that,
yeah.
that's a reason to write music, and I think that is something meaningful and is something worth doing. Um, yeah, so that was kind of the idea. In the video, I say that it's a crab cannon.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
so people that are in on the joke or like know what a crab cannon is, they can like, oh, where is this thing reversed and where is it not reversed?
yeah,
You can kind of it's a
yeah,
little bit of a game,
yeah.
where you have to watch it a couple times,
Yes,
and engage with it, in a deeper way,
yes,
hopefully,
yes,
at least.
yes.
Um,
Sure.
yeah, then, after that fact, it's like, then how do we put that in a live setting, right? And so then I had to make this patch that live loops it and live records.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, well, how do I also acknowledge what it takes to actually make that happen, right? Don't just reproduce it, but like make it in a way that makes sense when it's produced live,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we get into the loop and how do we get out of the loop? Because then there is a beginning, middle, and end, and that's a problem we have to deal with. Um, yeah, it's definitely a project. I just like it just last summer. There was no reason to do it. I just thought of it and did it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we found it very exciting, and I would like to write more pieces
Right.
for that. But figure out how to make it live and make it easy so that I can get performance royalties, and all of this, and make it work in a concert setting.
When you when you mention reason, when there's no reason for it, how do you treat reasoning? Or if you ever thought of it, what do you consider? How do you consider reason in composition? Does it matter what is the reason to compose something? Does it matter there being a reason, or does it matter that there is no reason? Do you ever think about this?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because a lot of things mean a lot of things, I think.
Yeah, of course, but
Um,
of course on the case of your own practice.
yeah, I would say, if I'm just taking that question, and let's say the most general way, I find that there kind of does need to be a reason for why, because I think we can say there's no reason for something, um, but I think it's very often there is an implicit reasoning. Like we already know why we're doing something, even if it seems to us in some moments that there isn't a reason at
Mhm.
that time, because we have other people that depend on us that want music. Um, we have other music that we've listened to. We understand the way that music works, based off of whatever music that we've heard.
Mhm.
Um, I think that kind of gives us a implicit reason already, whether we acknowledge that or not. Let's say.
Mhm.
Um, I think there are a lot of, you know, um, there's a lot more we could go into on the specifics of that. Um, but I've also found that, like, in terms of like any given specific piece, it's kind of more maybe more yes and no. Like there could be a reason, there could not.
Mhm.
If I'm thinking like, oh, I have to do this thing to have this exact result, like I don't find that to be a very conducive to being creative, right? It's like, oh, me always not living up to the reason of what I thought the reason was, let's
Mhm.
say. And but on the other hand, if I have no reason at all, like if I'm just going to write a piece for nothing, like I don't know where it's going to be performed or who it's for, or maybe what musical lineage or what place in the musical canon, or what relationship it has.
Mhm.
The thing that I'm doing, that also doesn't really help me be creative either. Because then, like, what do I do? Like, I don't know. I don't know what sounds I would use. And so I think there's a lot of like, there's a reason, there's not a reason. It kind of goes both ways, and it kind of depends on what your specifics are. That's kind of what that makes me think of.
So thank you for always when attempting these kind of questions. I
Mm-hmm.
realize
Mm-hmm.
i- it's not simple questions. It is, however, always interesting to hear or give it a thought and hear a thought from you as the presenting composer. Um, Further now to your compositional opus, perhaps back to the overview. We've now you have now addressed a couple of uh, perspectives. Is there something else? If if I was to ask about what is always a concern of yours, or perhaps in most compositions, a concern of yours, what do you always keep in mind or work with when composing that you have not yet mentioned today?
Yeah. One thing I've kind of alluded to a couple times in this conversation, that I haven't said yet is, I'm really interested in the idea of musical meta narrative. Um, I think that in other art forms, like film, for example, um, the use of meta narrative and talking about the story that you're telling while you're telling the story,
Mm-hmm.
is very important in very many films. I think like it's almost more common than not. Let's say, um, and music is kind of a different thing, right? Because music is not necessarily a narrative form. Like you can view it as that, but I don't know that
Mm-hmm.
it's necessarily, um, it's not necessarily narrative. Um,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, because we're not using words, we're not using stories. Let's say, in a direct way, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm especially recently, I've been really interested in, finding ways that we can do that in music. Let's say, um, lots of music does do this. I think, you know for a long time. For example, like sonatas with introductions, right? Sonatas in the Baroque period and late Baroque period, they just start, right? They give you the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, Beethoven would put something before the beginning, let's say, and it's some narrative device that frames the music that happens after. And that's because he's giving a statement on the form of music that came before, I think, right? You know, Chopin also in the ballades, there's an introduction and then there's the beginning, the real beginning.
Like a dressel of the historical context and then the composition.
Yeah, and but not just the historical context, but also the possibility of the narrative form of the art form of music itself. Let's say, like the idea that we can listen to something in time, and that we structure our experience of sound, you know, with the beginning, middle, and end. You can have something that's before the beginning. That's not something that's obvious in music, right? Or you know, a coda is after the end, right? You know, codas have been a thing for a very long time,
as well as preludes
and preludes, yes, yeah. And an entire section of music itself is before what the thing is, but then that a prelude becomes its own thing, like it has become its own form, and now people play preludes by themselves as like its own piece of music. You know, that's an interesting thing. I guess. Yeah, or you know, I mean, more recently, like extremes of duration. You know, that's kind of I think is something like that's kind of getting at a type of meta narrative. You know, I'm thinking of the works of Morton Feldman. You know, the idea that you just repeat something so much in a way that makes a sound devoid of what happens before and after, that you can listen to a sound and analyze it through repetition on its own terms, and that we're repeating it as a way of getting out of the idea of beginning, middle, and end, or perhaps making a commentary on what that whole process means, right? And so repetition, you know, that's, of course, almost all music has repetition, let's say. But I'm really interested in using it to that end, right? And in what ways can we use repetition to maybe get at the idea of musical meta narrative in a way that maybe other art forms do. This is something I don't quite have answers myself on.
Yeah.
But it's something I've been thinking about.
Are there any specific pieces that are already published that you've been working on that?
Yeah, I think that violin solo I was just talking about is probably, I think, maybe my most successful example of that.
It's the crab canon violin?
The crab canon, yes. Yeah, the idea that 1 minute of music can contain more than 1 minute of music within it, and necessarily needs to have more than 1 minute, something like that, right?
So it comes also to time and in a sense, yeah. When on the subject of a narrative and that meta narrative in music, what are your thoughts, observations of how we listen to music? Because you mentioned, yes, you can listen to it in a narrative way, and often I would, let's say, speculate that also happens, as well as connecting it to anything language and thought that contains language. So listening to music like that. What are your observations on that case? How via this work that you're doing with the musical meta narrative, is there an aim to perhaps more easily afford actually only listening to music on a level of music, or what? Anything, perhaps I'm suggesting now, sorry. Please just take it over, take over this chaotic question.
Yeah. That makes me think of a few things. Yeah, I mean, one thing, if you think about canons, for example, um, the idea that you have one musical idea and then that is repeated later, um, that's not an obvious thing, but that um, precludes a certain way of listening to music, or let's say understanding how time works. The idea that if we know something is going to happen 3 beats later, the exact same thing, that's going to impact your action in the present,
Mm.
right? I think that's something that music is very good at. Um, and that, like, depending on how the temporal relationships work out, that will inform one sense of counterpoint,
Mm.
right? If time moves backwards, if we just assume that time moves backwards, which it doesn't, but let's just assume that it does, what implications does that have for our musical decisions? Either when we're composing, which is kind of an out of time kind of thing, or listening, which is always in time, um, can take on very many different meanings, right? So the whole meta narrative thing is applied to music thing. There's something in that where it's like to approach meta narrative with something as abstract as music is to it's almost making a commentary on our understanding of time itself, or it's informing. It's almost a technology for our way of understanding time,
Hmm.
or let's say measuring time, something like that, right? Which I think is um, something very interesting. Um, I think also another thing your question made me think
What
of.
do you mean by
Yeah,
that? If I may, like, what? Let's say I don't understand. What is that? Music is a technology of understanding time. Can you?
yeah. I'm actually borrowing. That's a quote I'm borrowing. It's from there's a British artist named Mark Fell, who I'm writing a paper on for my doctoral dissertation right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think what he means by that is that, like, what music is a way of relating our perceptual experience to how we understand which direction time is moving. Let's say, there's types of music where you think of things in very short amounts of time, and it's moment to moment. You
Mm-hmm.
know, at this moment I'm thinking of it this way. At this moment I'm thinking of it this way. But then the juxtaposition of those two moments maybe inspires a more global, maybe non-hierarchical way of listening. Something like that. Yeah, a canon is another one, right? Looping
Mm.
is another one. The idea of thinking of time as cyclical, something that happens over and over again. How are you gonna act and make sound in the world, if we think of time as moving this way? If it's a loop, is a loop that's 1 second long is going to be very different than a loop that's 3 hours long,
Mm.
right? Um, and so using those measurements of time is kind of, I think, what he was saying in this quote that I'm using, is a way of it's a tool for our way of understanding things in the way that, let's say, like a tape measure is. The idea that you're gonna have a tape measure, and, like, 1 inch is going to be the same inch no matter where you put it, right? That's not obvious, and that doesn't apply to all forms of measurement, right? There are some forms of measurement that are very contextual and only work in certain situations. Like say, like, a tape measure that's been pulled out, or stretched out over use for many years, but can still be useful for a particular person that understands space in that way, and we can kind of use that for time. Something like that. I don't know if I
Yeah.
have that straight in my
Mhm.
head.
What comes what comes to mind for me is that there's in many conversations of synopsis a question arising, which is historically, let's say, there was a lot of addressing the experience of music as emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And now the question that arises oftentimes is it really the emotion that experiences? Because what if emotion is actually just one way of doing it, or perhaps something that actually is after the experience
Mm-hmm.
of music? And if that would be so, what is then the way of listening to music? Is there a completely separate, not separate, but rather um, a form of listening on its own that pertains to experiencing this level physically? I don't know how, this music level. Now, what I thought of when you speak to this, perhaps, and it's just to entertain the thought. What if what was happening there, at least in some cases, was actually we were just experiencing time in so many different movements, directions, uh, ways, and that on its own is the experience of music in that case.
Yeah, I think a related question to that is like the one is whether music is a social act,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know, if you, we often say maybe just casually or colloquially that music is a form of communication, right? And it's like, well, you know, what kind of communication is that, right? Is it like instilling an emotional experience in another person, and that is the mark of success of what a work of art is, right? I'm not so sure about that. Like it could be, you
Mm-hmm.
know, but it's like, you know, if it is to elicit an emotional response in someone, you know, is it the same emotional response for every person that listens to that, you know? And I also think that that issue is very much bound up with historical context. You know, if you have a certain set of expectations, you know, the emotion that's elicited is probably related to that, right? And what you hear in another piece of music, it's going to be informed by our common social understanding of music together.
Which does not only go for music in the end. That's also something
I think any type of
in
social
general.
interaction.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Mm.
But also, there's also a component to music where it's not, it's completely different. It's like an abstract study of acoustics or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, I think music technology, like it, something I love about music technology is like learning about acoustics and sine waves and overtones and, you know, like the very very simple and basic models that we have for sound itself.
Mm.
Um, like I find that so exciting, and I wouldn't call it emotional. It's something that like only I can understand, like divorced from what other people tell me, or I don't know, something like that. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's what I would say.
I, do you think that's also connected with also educating oneself and being active in the physical uh, uh, as a science as side of music?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you know, like in my work with instruments, for example, you know, like I can look at something acoustically and like think about it all day, but you know, the second I touch it and play it, I learn something completely different,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So you know, what we call scientific, you know, that might have more meanings than, you know, what you might originally think. Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
So, to briefly touch upon your doctoral thesis in the writing as well, would
Hmm.
you be so kind to perhaps make yeah, a short overview of what you're working on there?
Yeah. So I'm at the end of a 4-year doctorate, um, and the future is uncertain right now. um, but I had to write a piece as a part of that, an extended piece, and then I am also writing a paper. The piece I've just finished. It will be performed about a month from now, a little bit more than a month from now, and that was for Pierrot ensemble, Pierrot plus percussion.
From UK?
Hmm?
From UK? Pierrot Ensemble?
No, like the chamber ensemble called Pierrot.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so it's a flute, clarinet, violin, cello, piano,
Where are they
percussion.
based?
It's no specific ensemble. It's a general ensemble.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, like the Schoenberg piece, Pierrot
Yes,
Lunaire.
yes, 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 yes.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's that ensemble, and
Oh,
I've recruited my own my
pardon
own
me.
ensemble. Yeah,
I actually only know one, and I learned today that this is actually a standard form of the ensemble. Good, good.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's like Eighth Blackbird in the U.S. is a Pierrot ensemble.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Yeah,
So,
it's very useful. It's very useful to write for because it's kind of a general purpose
right.
chamber music kind of thing. That's kind of the
Yeah.
idea of that piece, basically.
All right. All right. Good.
And that piece touches on a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. I've just put the double bar on it, and I'm,
Mm-hmm.
you know, sprucing up the parts and, talking to the players right now. And so that's the part I've done the most work on,
Mm-hmm.
and is, I feel like is my strongest piece so far.
So
And so,
we'll be able to hear that after its premiere, also on the
yeah.
internet, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so that'll be a few months from now. So
Right.
aiming by, May or June to have something like that on my YouTube channel, some version of it.
All right.
Um,
Yes, please.
yeah, I'm also writing a paper on this British musician named Mark Fell, um, and I find his work really interesting. The paper is not my specific thesis is not so far along yet, but he makes some generative techno music, um,
Hmm.
is what I would call it, mostly with the computer, right? He kind of grew up in the kind of British club music scene, and is really interested in those sounds, but kind of wanted to take it in a more experimental direction. Um, and one of his big points that he makes is that the way to be creative in music, like a musical idea, is necessarily related to the technology used to make it. So it's not. Another way to put that is, the way musical ideas happen is not, you think of an idea in your head or imagine the perfect idea and then you make that sound.
Mm-hmm.
It's that you start making it in the world, um, and then you kind of let's say sculpt it out of that technology, and it's based on the relationship between your own agency as a person and the affordances of that technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
That resonates with me very much, and it's something that we don't really talk about in kind of the conservatory model of music. I think it's kind of like assumed that you want to get the idea in your head onto the page, right? But I've never found that, and I think that we should talk about that more. And it's something that when I'm talking to other people about creativity, that's something that I very much am interested in expressing, is that you should be involved in the technology, and have a relationship with it, and not like a hierarchical way of like, oh, this computer or instrumentalist for that matter, or notation program, whatever thing, it's not serving your mind. It's going both ways.
Yeah.
Um,
So also towards what it takes to develop actually that interface between
Yes.
one's idea or a thought and its actual realization.
Yeah, or I would, or it's yeah, that, and also the fact that like the idea comes from the realization. Like you don't, like I don't have an
Right,
idea unless
right, right.
that's not related to what the realization is going to be,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Um, so yeah,
First,
I'm
doing
thinking
it,
about that.
basically.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
If I may simplify
Sure. Yeah.
very much. All right, so we are at the end of this conversation. So at this point, I will ask you for the conclusion, which is two messages, which I usually ask my guests here. First one is a message to any aspiring composer, and the second one is considering you are also a composer in, I hope, in development. And the second one to anyone that will, after this, go and listen to your music.
Hmm. Wait, what was the second question again?
The second one is for any listeners that, or anyone that will go to your webpage and
Hmm.
hear the performances of your compositions.
Hmm.
Briefly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess for other composers, I think we'll quote Willem Dafoe and say that I don't really give advice to other. It's not my business.
But
I
it's
think
not
everyone.
necessarily an advice, it's a
Yeah,
message.
yeah, yeah. I think everyone has to find their own path, and that like no one is going to give you the answer. Like you really have to find it yourself. Yeah, that's what I'm have found, and I'm constantly refinding myself all the time. Like the answer is not out there. Like you have to really find what you're interested in, and there's no way around that. I say, and I would say, and I think that's what composition is, and
Mm.
it should be that way. Um, for my music, for a message to people that want to listen to my music, yeah, I have a YouTube page. I am finding things out myself all the time. I still feel very much in development as a composer. Um, and yeah, I just hope the stuff that I've said in this interview that you can hear that in my music, or I would hope so. And I'm always trying to, you know, better realize these ideas in music. Um, but yeah, I'm mainly on YouTube. That's where most of my work lives. And I also have a SoundCloud page as well, where I have some stuff that's not on my YouTube. Um, but yeah, I have a few pieces for chamber ensembles, chamber orchestra, um, classical instruments, all of this, and then I have a few pieces for um, technology, like technological kinds of pieces. I think those two are kind of very separate in my body of work now, um, and they have very different sets of musical concerns. So I think if you care to look at what I've done, I think you would probably find that. And I'm, always trying to bring those two approaches together, and I hope that they cross-populate between each other. So that would be my message.
Logan Barrett, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.